Hi, I'm Vahideh, and together with Olga, we are going to present the paper Fairness and the Support of Redistributive Environmental Policies.
Yes, I am Olga, and our main question about this paper is about who should pay for the energy transition. So we'll start from the slideshow one that I'll present it after this to help us explain about this paper. So imagine the government wants to speed up the shift to renewable energy. Most people will probably agree with that goal. But there's a much more controversial question hiding behind it. Who should actually pay for the energy transition? Environmental policies don't hit everyone equally. Governments often exempt certain groups from the cost, for example, low-income households, because energy charges eat up a bigger share of their income, or energy-intensive companies to protect their international competitiveness. So here's the question this paper asked. Does public support for a climate policy change depending on who is let off the hook? That's the subject of Andor, Lange, and Sommer's 2022 paper in the Journal of Environmental Economics and Management. Here's the real-world backdrop. Germany financed its renewable energy expansion through the EEG levy, a surcharge added to every household's electricity bill. In 2018, the levy stood at about 6.79 cents per kilowatt hour, roughly to about 28% of the average household electricity price. But not everyone paid the same way. Ordinary households pay the levy in full, while a subset of energy-intensive companies, the paper notes about 4% of industrial firms, consuming roughly 40% of industrial electricity. So it received exemptions to protect their international competitiveness. And that creates a genuine trade-off for policymakers. They have to balance environmental effectiveness, economic efficiency, distributional fairness, and critically political feasibility. Even a policy that's environmentally sound can stall if citizens think its costs are distributed unfairly. The tension is exactly what this paper tests. To test this, the authors ran a large stated choice survey experiment with about 6,000 German household heads in cooperation with the Survey Institute for South. Everyone answered one simple yes or no question. And would you accept a higher EEG levy by 1, 2, or 4 cents per kilowatt hour to raise the renewable electricity share by 10 percentage points? The trick is in what people were told beforehand. Participants were randomly split into 8 groups that varied the information about assumptions. Some were told industry exemptions would stay in place. Others were told those exemptions would be abolished. Others heard about exemptions for low-income households instead, or a combination of both. So everyone faced the same environmental goal and a comparable cost. The only thing that changed was who was described as exempt. That lets the authors isolate one clean question. How does changing who pays affect support for the exact same policy?
This is the heart of the paper, so let's take a moment with the chart. Each line tracks one policy condition as the price tag rises from 1 to 2 to 4 cents per kilowatt per hour. Look at the two extremes first. The green line, abolishing the industry exemption, sits on top the entire time, starting at 73.2% support and staying above 59% even at the highest cost. The orange line, keeping industry exempt, sits at the bottom the entire time, falling from 33.5% down to just 22.8%. Now compare that to the control group in gray, where participants were simply told about the cost with no mention of exemptions at all. Support runs from 60.6% down to 42.3%. Exempting low income households in blue tracks a very similar path, 61.6% down to 44.5%. So, on its own, a low income exemption doesn't substantially move support relative to the no information baseline. What sharply reduces support is specifically the industry exemption. The red line, combining both exemptions, lands in between from 44.2% down to 34.3%. That's the important result. If industry exemptions are politically unavoidable, adding a low income exemption on top increases average support by roughly 10% relative to the industry exemption alone. Of course, price matters too, and it's worth isolating that effect on its own. In the control group, no exemption information at all, support falls as the levy increases about 61% at 1% at 1 cent, 45% at 2 cents, and 42% at 4 cents per kilowatt per hour. That's an intuitive result. More expensive policies get less support, but the previous slide already showed that the size of the bill isn't the whole story. Citizens are implicitly asking two separate questions. How much do I personally have to pay, and who else is paying or being let off? Both questions move the needle, and the distributional one turns out to move it by more than doubling the cost does. But why such a big gap? The authors point to fairness perceptions. Only 7.6% of respondents thought the industry exemption was fair. For the low income exemption, that number jumps to roughly 60%. That alone goes a long way toward explaining the support gap we just saw. To dig deeper, the authors also ran an independent allocation experiment separate from the policy questions to measure inequality aversion, whether someone consistently prefers a more equal distribution of payoffs across three hypothetical pupils, even at some cost to the total amount. About 37% of respondents behave this way, choosing the most equal split every time. Here's the interesting part. This trait explains support for household exemptions but has no power for industry exemptions. For low income households, more inequality averse respondents are more supportive of exempting them, consistent with wanting to reduce overall inequality. Industry exemptions don't hook into that same psychology at all, which is exactly why justifying them with competitiveness arguments doesn't rescue their popularity. The big picture takeaway: people don't just ask, what does this cost me? They ask, is this distribution of cost fair? And that judgment does real political work.
So, what should a policymaker actually take from this? Three lessons. First, distributional design is not a footnote you add after the policy is set. Who pays can swing public support by 30 or 40 percentage points, more than doubling the price does. Second, industry exemptions carry a real political cost. There may be good economic reasons to protect energy-intensive firms from losing competitiveness, but simply explaining that justification to respondents did not rescue support in this experiment. The exemption itself is what people react to. Third, if an industry exemption is considered non-negotiable, adding a low-income exemption on top of it still helps, raising support by roughly 10 percentage points across every cost level we saw. The result is a genuine trade-off between competitiveness, fairness, and the political feasibility of getting a climate policy passed at all. A few limitations are worth flagging. The study captures only the household perspective. It doesn't observe how industry itself would lobby or react politically. The tested cost range tops out at 4 cents per kilowatt hour, so we don't know if the pattern holds at much higher carbon prices. And the fairness and inequality aversion measures were elicited in a separate, generic task outside the specific policy context. Finally, this is a 2018 survey of German households. Generalizing to other countries or policy instruments should be done cautiously. Our proposed extension run the same design, but for carbon pricing, instead of a renewable energy levy, and instead of just testing assumptions, compare different compensation mechanisms head to head. A target exemption for low-income households, their cash compensation, and an equal climate dividend paid to everyone. Repeating that across several European countries will tell us whether these fairness effects are a German idiosyncrasy or something more universal.
To close this paper leaves policymakers with a simple but important message. Environmental policy is not only about how much society pays, it's also about who pays. Industry exemptions substantially reduced public support in this experiment, while exemptions for low income households were viewed far more favorably, and adding one on top of the other measurably improved acceptance. Fairness perceptions and inequality aversion help explain exactly why. So, designing an ambitious climate policy is not just an environmental economics problem, it's also a question of who bears the cost and whether citizens believe that distribution is fair. Get that wrong, and an otherwise well designed policy can lose the public support it needs to survive. Thank you.